Right. Okay. I'm going to kick us off. So, hi, everyone. Welcome to our last and final session of Intimate Archives, a webinar series that I've been running with my colleague, Kaya Arujo, on behalf of a project that we're both part of called Governing Intimacies. Just very briefly, if you don't know about the project or us, I'll just introduce ourselves very briefly. Governing Intimacies basically aims to produce feminist queer scholarship on the South, from the South. More substantively, it's been a 5-year project, which actually is just ending. And it's really been about developing new scholarship and a new generation of scholars in gender and sexuality studies in Southern Africa and India. My name is Srila Roy, and I'm the principal investigator of the project. I'm also a feminist sociologist here at WITS. And Kaya Arujo is a postdoctoral fellow at WISER at WITS. And he's been part of many millions of things, tentacles of this project, but really at the heart of this particular series, Intimate Archives. And indeed, anything that I say about the series, which I will just tell you briefly, is all his idea. And, really he's been the intellectual fuel behind it. So just very briefly, the series has been running since the beginning of the year, and roughly it had 2 primary objectives. One was to really think about the archive much more creatively, much more capaciously, in relation to a whole series of questions around collective memory, marginalization, history writing, belonging, justice redressal, decolonization, democratization, and so on and so forth. Secondly, the series was meant to support a theoretical and methodological conversation into history writing and archiving in the Global South, with a slight emphasis on queer sexualities, given that last year we ran a webinar series which had a slight bias towards gender. So we were trying to sort of improve on that. And finally, the point of the series was really to showcase new work, new scholarship, especially to do with African gender and feminist studies from the continent and from elsewhere, and also bring it into conversation with scholarship from elsewhere, often, but not only South Asia. And that's been, I would say, one of the key ambitions of this project, which is to really think comparatively and think transnationally, and not in just in terms of what possibilities those open up, but what might they foreclose, what might be the limits. So and I feel like I've been thinking a lot more about that as this project comes to an end. Not just take that for granted that comparative or transnational thinking is a good in and of itself, but what might actually, what might it foreclose. So I think it's fair to say, I'm speaking on behalf of you, Kayo, but I think it's fair to say that the series has really exceeded our expectations. We've had some really, really brilliant speakers, early career scholars, established scholars from a range of places. And I've just really learned a lot. And I think this final session, we have 3 speakers who, for me, really redefine what it means to think about intimacy and sexuality, to really push us to think about it in new ways, engaging with intimate archives in a host of ways. And by putting the 3 of you and your work in conversation, I think for Kayo and me, it went back to really the central thread of the whole series, which was to reimagine intimacy and the archive, both through historical research, but also through creative writing. Okay, I'm going to just introduce the speakers to you, just to say I'm so pleased that so many of you have tuned in. If you're in South Africa, I know the conditions are impossible. So thank you very much for making the time. Right, so our speakers have sent very modest bios, I have to say. So I'm going to try and do a little more justice to it. Durba Mitra is Assistant Professor of Women, Gender and Sexuality at Harvard University. Durba, you have so many more titles and accolades, and I can't even put them all here, but people should know, and it should be in all of your bios. Durba's book, Indian Sex Life, Sexuality, and the Colonial Origins of Modern Social Thought, is absolutely pathbreaking. Someone described it as the new canon, and I think that is absolutely right. The book is looking at how ideas of female sexual deviancy are foundational to modern social thought in colonial India and beyond. And currently she's doing a new book project, which is looking at the history of third world feminist thought and South-South feminist research projects from the 1970s and the 1980s. I'm just so excited about this project. Habiba Badroun, it does need an introduction for many people here in South Africa. Again, such a modest bio, because I think it's more apt to describe you, as a lot of media pieces do, as one of the most important literary voices from South and on South Africa. Habiba is the author of poetry collections, The Dream in the Next Body, 100 Silences, The History of Intimacy, which was first published by Quayla Books and has been, I think, just this year published a US edition, and it's also an award-winning book. Indeed, Habiba's work has received several prizes and recognitions, also from the NIHSS. Habiba's most recently co-edited with Desiree Lewis, an essay collection on being Black and feminist in South Africa called Surfacing. And I don't know if you're going to talk about that at all, but as you know, and we were just discussing it, a lot of us are reading that volume, a lot of us are teaching that volume, engaging the volume, and we're just so pleased and lucky for the gift of that volume. So thank you. Habiba is extraordinary professor of English at Stellenbosch and associate professor of women and gender and sexuality studies African studies at Penn State, where she co-directs the African Feminist Initiative. Again, another fantastic gift that I think a lot of us benefit from. And finally, they'll be joined in conversation with our own Puss Kiguwa, who will act as a discussant in this conversation. Puss is an associate professor in psychology here at Wits. Puss has edited and written several edited volumes, special issues. Puss, you didn't furnish us with all those details, but I will have the one I really know, because Wits News has splashed it all over, is you are the new Oppenheimer Memorial Trust Rising Star at Wits University. Many congratulations, Puss. So yeah, thank you so much. I think everyone knows our format, but I'll just remind our audience. Speakers will speak for no more than 15 minutes. Puss will respond for 10, and then we'll just open it up to questions, comments. Please keep them coming through using the chat function or the Q&A button, whatever suits you best. Durba.
Well, thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here. Thanks especially to Srila Roy for this invitation to be part of this, I really think, field-changing conversation, the kind of combination between this and the previous series. This one being on governing intimacies, and to Kayo for putting this event together. Thanks also to Puss Kiguwa for helping us think together across very different approaches to the question of intimacy. And I'm especially humbled to be in conversation today, to be in conversation with Habiba, because just of how important her work has been in terms of coalition building, in terms of intellectual thought, but also in terms of a poetics of trying to imagine intimacy. It's really a privilege to hear you and to think with you today. So today, I'm just going to speak very briefly about my first book, as well as my current research that thinks critically about sexuality and the rise of the social sciences in the 1970s and 1980s. My book, Indian Sex Life, Sexuality, and the Colonial Origins of Modern Social Thought, is an account of how ideas of deviant female sexuality, often named as the prostitute, became foundational to modern social theory and social science in colonial India. In the book, I explore how social scientists in India, Indian, colonial, administrators, European men, American social scientists made scientific claims about deviant female sexuality in the constitution of new fields of knowledge about social life. Over the course of the book, I make visible a complex edifice of knowledge that saw women's sexual deviancy as the primary way in which one could think and write about India as a whole. The book works to assemble together diverse archives across many different fields of what today would constitute the modern social sciences, from Indology to legal sociology, from forensic science to biology, to ethnology and early anthropology to history. Over the course of the book, I try to account for a system of modern social thought premised on the absolute exhaustive study of the subject of female sexual deviancy across genres and authorities, philological studies that sought to find answers for the future of modern society in ancient text, legal sociology in cases of trafficking, contagious diseases, abortion, and infanticide, forensic evidence in the cases of abortion, ethnological and anthropological theories of comparative civilizations, in fact, the very origins we might think of the project of modern comparison itself, lay sociologies and women's autobiographies. In the context of the Indian social sciences, colonial military men, administrators, scholars, Indian elites, specifically largely upper caste Hindu men, desperately and obsessively sought to detail and equate all forms of feminized desire with sexual deviancy and prostitution, in particular, equating low caste women, Muslims, widows, and Dalit women and laboring women with prostitutes and prostitution. In colonial India, the category prostitute was used to describe virtually all women outside of monogamous marriage and many within, particularly as a marker of caste subordination and Muslim difference, including the tawaif, the courtesan, the dancing girl, the high caste Hindu widow, Hindu and Muslim polygamous women, low caste Muslim women dock workers, indentured women who were forcibly transported across the British Empire, low class beggars, women shopkeepers, migratory laboring women who moved across the spaces of South Asia and the ocean, Indian Ocean, women followers of religious sects, women performers, theater actors, urban industrial laborers, and domestic servants. That's just some of the types of people who were understood to be prostitutes. Ideas of the control of racialized, feminized sexuality, especially through stringent forms of marriage, served as the primary model for major social scientific concepts from the 19th century, concepts that came to rule the modern social sciences as a whole, where India functioned as an essential exemplar in the making of modern comparative studies in the social sciences. Terms like marriage, descent, kinship, to endogamy and exogamy, to broad understandings of the very definition of evolution, progress, organization, development, and change. Following Black feminist Hortense Spillers, then, I engage in a critical moment, what Spillers describes at the intersection of coloniality and enslavement, quote, how sexuality as a discursive cluster breaks out at the end of the 18th century in what she describes as, quote, another version of Western historical time, a strategy of the historiographical, end quote. It is this framework of feminized sexuality as a strategy of the historiographical, to use Spiller's phrase, that creates the sexual diagnostic of racial lag and lack that we inherit in our present. And it is that question of how to think about sexuality as a strategy of historiographical imagination that really animates my work. The book thus places female sexuality, as I describe it in the book, often named as the prostitute, at the heart of the study of society itself in the modern world, where feminized sexuality is central to the making of modern sexuality as we know it. I argue that at the core of the modern understanding of the prostitute is a definitional fluidity that requires a history. That is to say, we might think of the prostitute as a kind of queer figure. The prostitute, when dislocated from the urge to recuperate her as an identity, as a sex worker or solely a woman with agency through questions of commercial sex, takes on a different history as a key concept that organizes the modern study of society, placing feminized sexual deviancy at the foundation to the very making of social life itself in the colonial world as an object of study. Indian sex life is purposely focused in scope on the question of feminized sexuality. I focus on many forms of sexual deviancy that the concept of prostitute came to encompass over diverse disciplinary fields of knowledge. I work to show how the concept of the prostitute in India is suited to essentialist ideas of sexual difference that are produced from the 18th century onward, linking biologically determinist ideas of womanhood and a new social science of womanhood to the study of society itself. Thinking this constitutive history of gendering as racialized sexuality for me is critical. We might turn to another genealogy that I explore in the book, the genealogy of the English term sexuality itself. The English term sexuality appears in colonial natural science textbooks in the moment of massive British colonial expansion in the last decades of the 18th century, just as British philologist and jurist William Jones, the famed translator of the laws of Manu in the formulation of colonial Hindu law, began his translation project in colonial India. In his 1776 poem, The Hindu Wife, where Jones is in fact practicing his Sanskrit as he's learning it, Jones invents a Linnaean taxonomical term in Latin to classify the Indian woman. He takes from botany the principle of sexual difference to comprehend the colonized Indian woman. He names her polyandrian monogynean. Jones recreates in a poem the Indian woman as a scientific type. Many men, polyandrian for one woman, monogynean. In an enduring racial typology of sexual excess and sexual difference of Indian women that came to shape knowledge in the centuries that followed. Now, while there are many genealogies of sexualities made deviant in the colonial world, my book argues that in the context of colonial India, the concept of the prostitute and the many forms of sexual transgression linked to biological womanhood that she encompassed and cohered is distinct in its foundational place in the making of social life as an object of study. Any and all women could transgress into sexual deviancy. All women could fall and become a prostitute. And that persistent threat made female sexual deviancy a particularly flexible and fecund idea in the making of majoritarian social theories, everything from upper caste supremacy to heterosexual reproduction and compulsory heterosexuality to religious difference. These theories were influential across social scientific disciplines and beyond. In this way, the concept of the prostitute and the many social behaviors and types that she coheres is unique in her place as a constitutive concept for modern social theory and science, disciplinary structures of knowledge that endure long after the end of colonialism. I believe that there is critical significance to the work of these ideas of naturally excessive sexuality that is feminized, named prostitute, in the very making of sexuality and sexual difference in the modern social sciences, in a vocabulary that we often inherit and uncritically use in trying to reimagine questions of sexuality. In order to think the contours of redress for this violent past of the history of the social sciences, at the end of my book, I turn to a kind of critical fabulation, to use Saidiya Hartman's phrase, that is, from the geography and time of my study, colonial Calcutta, in the work of Muslim woman writer Rokeya Sakawat Hussain, in her 1905 Sultana's Dream, a very famous short story from Calcutta about a place called Ladyland. In the face of social condemnation of women around her, Rokeya Hussain imagines a world of womanhood based in a radical vision of women's autonomy and self-governance. Hussain's Ladyland is a peaceful world ruled by freedom experiments of women who are no longer bound to the patriarchal home. In the final kind of reflections of the book, then I ask, why do we treat Rokeya Hussain Sultana's Dream as a critical project of whimsical fantasy? Why is it only celebrated in its existence as the first feminist science fiction? when we continuously endow modern social science and social theory with all of its crude and violent fabulation and speculation about female sexuality, about the deviancy of women, as the primary authority about social life based in fact and science. I basically then try to think about two modes of speculation, one of which is named fiction, the other which gets to claim the mantle of science itself. The history of this has a long afterlife in the context of South Asia today. It is present in authoritarian regimes, as we see. This history of the control of women's sexuality is indeed excessive, its resonance all too clear. In the language of authoritarian discourses of Hindutva, patriarchal majoritarianism across India now, womanhood is in crisis because of its excess. Women are not capable of being free or independent. We can see that again and again in multiple laws across India that are being passed that are restricting caste marriage and that are restricting particularly or defining women's sexual excess in terms of their vulnerability and submission to Muslim men, as we see in the legal language of consent and coercion, which parallels the language of the 19th century in a spate of anti-Muslim laws against interreligious marriage, or the so-called love jihad laws, explored at length by the amazing feminist scholar Charu Gupta. We see deeply violent language of the control of excesses in discourse of women's spatial, bodily, and social transgression in endemic cases of upper caste sexual violence against Dalit girls and women. And in spaces across South Asia, in places like Pakistan, we see increasingly alarming trends of sexual and gendered violence, violence directed at women's marches, articulated yet again in a language of feminized excess in public space against normative values. In my work more broadly, I explore how ideas of sexual subordination of feminized subjects have shaped the intimate relationship between modern knowledge and emancipatory politics in the colonial and post-colonial world. In my most recent research, I have taken the insights of my first book to ask, how can we account for the inheritance of this profoundly heavy legacy of modern social science in the social study of women in the 1970s and 1980s, in the archives of development and third world women's research alliances across spaces and geographies in the South? How are we to think with the overflowing archive of policy reports on women while exceeding the often sterile enumerative language of state-sponsored social science? So again, end up in the social sciences to try to think about an archive that is so in excess that it kind of becomes the most abundant archive. It is the most abundant archive, certainly, for how we are to write women's history in the second half of the 20th century. But to think about, a series today about intimate archives and thinking about what it means to govern intimacies, there is very little intimacy, we may think, to be found in these kind of social scientific reports. From even a brief look at such archives, we are forced to confront thousands, if not millions, of pages of social scientific data, of policy studies, of time studies that measure women's work, of demographics, of ratios of sex and births, used to measure, quantify, objectify women's place in society, quantifications that through the language of poverty, of trafficking, obscure political questions of racial difference, caste domination, and social violence. Everything was to be measured on behalf of a new agenda of woman as a study of social science. Women's labor, women's reproductive capacity, the ubiquity of women's deaths, by malnutrition, by labor production, by gender and sexual violence, by birth rates, sex ratios, maternity health, measures used to demonstrate again and again to societies and cultures the value that women were supposed to have when they were alive. Today, we are confronted with an absolutely exhausting industry of NGO and policy reports now in our current moment in relation to the pandemic. So I am dwelling again with intimate or maybe perhaps sanitized archives and genres where we do not always find beauty or ambiguity or easy answers for social life, clear avenues to write fantastical histories of intimacy and liberation. Or in the vision of Rokeya Sakawat-Hussein, those experiments with other sustainable ways of knowing and building a world. In these archives of feminisms from the 1970s and 80s, translated later into the policy report and the NGO report, we find complex models of feminist solidarity, a sharing of knowledge and knowledge formations and research forms across geographies, and an early moment in feminist collective imagining across spaces like post-colonial South Asia, post-colonial sub-Saharan Africa, from East and West Africa to South Africa to the Caribbean. What forms became the norm for generating of people studying women? What genres have traction in the project of documenting today? And what genres might we try to imagine for a project of freedom? My work tries again, alongside the work of brilliant feminist and queer studies scholars, colleagues and collaborators across spaces, to think the political possibilities of thinking the forms of knowledge again for our present. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Durba. From the social sciences to poetry, Habiba, will poetry save us?
Perhaps you've asked a fundamental question now. Thank you so much to Srila and Prao and the team of Governing Intimacies for crafting this space, which is so hospitable and so nourishing. And to Durba for sort of a brilliant, astounding presentation. I was frantically scribbling notes, and which will live in my imagination and certainly in my reading. Can poetry save us? I'll leave that question for a little bit later, if I may. Since I started writing about 20 years ago, so I was forced to turn to the intimate, partly because trying to write anew about the racial and sexual configuration of South Africa forced me to realize that there had been archives that I had been so intent on abandoning, erasing, and in my own self embodying a disinhabiting of. And it was precisely these archives in the end that would provide to me the new insights and the very grounds in which to think. But it is painful to live in a body that sounds like something that has abandoned its past. Long before I had entered the academy school, I had already contorted my voice to sound more educated, to sound less Black, to sound more acceptable, I thought, as a body that would inhabit the academy. So in my imagination, in my mind, there were analogues to the abandonment that my voice embodied. And this is a very painful, but perhaps not unfamiliar example of what happens when certain bodies enter spaces that conform themselves to power, as we've just heard from Durba's brilliant presentation. So it is 20 years ago that I confront precisely those spaces and those archives that I now felt an intense desire to re-enter. And of course, re-entering the abandoned spaces is not easy at all. And so it was an act of great intensity, but it was also an act of trying to find ways into spaces that had been hospitable to me, that had been my own grounding, but which I had then rejected. I had then withdrawn myself from. So intimacy had become, in fact, quite distant for me. And it is only via routes such as really trying to pay honor to those precisely those spaces that I had dishonored, that it was possible for me, I think, to start to move back in a way that would be respectful and honoring and truly attentive to those spaces. The first example of an archive that I would like to share with you is from my book, regarding Muslims from slavery to post-apartheid. This book starts with the first 8 pages of my dissertation. And the first 8 pages of my dissertation also perhaps familiarly were written right at the end of that process. And what that describes is the meaning of the most prolific word in the South African Dictionary of English on Historical Principles, the South African Oxford Dictionary. And it is the South African version of the K word, the unspeakable word, which is the most abundant word in the dictionary. So this archive of words, which is a litany of incredible violence and incredible pain of trauma, is in fact a compelling testimony to the way in which violence writes itself on language, on land, and on bodies. So I look then at a word that is most documented and most forbidden. It is a crime to use it these days, as it should be. And it is also an archive on which I build a certain theory about subjectivity after colonialism. And it is a subjectivity that erases indigeneity and claims an indigeneity for a version of white subjectivity, which also is a heritage of colonialism. I won't read those first 8 pages, but they are probably the ones that I felt most compelled by in writing the dissertation and then later on the book. But I will read to you from my other works, which are the creative works that I took refuge in while being a PhD student. I didn't know at all that this would turn out to be the major path of my work. And now let me read to you from those 3 books that I've selected from and say a little bit about the archive on which I drew to write these particular poems. The first poem I'll read to you is from my first book ever, which was The Dream in the Next Body from 2005. It's called War Triptych: Silence, Glory, Love. I'll read it first and then speak a little bit about it. War Triptych: Silence, Glory, Love. 1. Accounting. The mother asked to stay. She looked at her silent child. I was waiting for you. The quiet of the girl's face was a different quiet. Her hands lay untouched by death. The washer of bodies cut away her long black dress. Blue prayer beads fell to the floor in a slow accounting. The washer of bodies began to sing a prayer to mothers and daughters. The mother said, "Who will wait for me?" 2. Father receives news his son died in the Intifada. When he heard the news, Mr. Karim became silent. He did not look at the cameras, nor at the people who brought their grief. He felt a hand slip from his hand, a small unclasping, and for that, he refused the solace of glory. 3. Always for the first time. We tell our stories of war like stories of love, innocent as eggs. But we will meet memory again at the wall around our city, always for the first time. That poem is a compilation poem, a portmanteau poem, a combination poem written in 2003, just at the start of the Iraq War. And it was a way for me as a student living in the UK, far from home, and simultaneously being immersed in theoretical books and the news to try to make sense of the kinds of intimacies of horror that were every day in our living rooms and in our bedrooms and in our studies, sometimes one room providing all of those spaces. And this was provoked by a newspaper article, one about a mother who lost her child in the Iraq War, one about a father in the Intifada who lost his son, and the third, a reflection then on how to make these archives and their intimacies not become ordinary, because to become ordinary is to forget about them. Sometimes the intimate is what you can forget. The next poem I will read to you is from my second book, Give. My second book is called 100 Silences, and the poem is called Give. And this is a poem inspired by my father. Many of my books are dedicated to my mother. My mother was the one who was the breadwinner in our household. My father was a house husband. My mother is a medical doctor. My father didn't finish high school. It's perhaps evident why my mother would feature so largely in my imagination as a feminist forefigure. My father, a quieter figure, is also very powerfully there. And this is, he died very young at the age of 56, just as I was on the point of leaving for the United States on a fellowship, literally a few days before then. And so I had to recover him. And this is one of the ways in which I try to do that. Give. Before dawn, low voices briefly loud. My father and his friend, the ambulance driver, his days off, always in the middle of the week, drive away from the house with thick sandwiches and a flask of tea, and my father's green and white fishing rod whipping the wind behind the 76 Corolla. Camping by the sea, we'd see him take his rod further down the beach, walk waist deep into the water, plant himself with legs apart in the breakers, reach back, cast the line baited with chokka and pull, giving, then tightening the line, nudging its weighted stream of gut to the fish. But in this place on the West Coast, they never disclosed. They stand unwatched, out of reach of each other's lines, at their backs, a fire on the beach, not stemming the dark, but deepening it. Often it would come to nothing, their planting and pulling. But sometimes the leather cups holding the ends of their fishing rods strained as they bent back against the high howl of the reels being run to the limit. And holding, bowing forward and giving, and leaning back and pulling, their bodies make a slow dance nobody sees. And at home, the scraping of scales from Cholyun and Yellowtail, and slitting the silver slick of skin to make thick steaks for supper, setting aside the cater for breakfast, the head for soup, and the gills and fat for the cats, while they tell us how they landed them. I wonder about the empty days, more frequent. The solitary standing in the dark at the edge of something vast, sea and sky, throwing a thin line into the give of it, and waiting, silent and waiting, until something pulls against your weight. I think one of the great lessons of the archives is how to look at something whose face is turned away and not force it to look at you. And for me, often the silent story of men in Africa is one of those phenomena. Now I'm going to read from my last book, which is The History of Intimacy. It has two covers because it came out in two editions, and I love both of them. One is some sparrows from my mother's backyard, and one is a rendering of the sea in Simonstown, where I lived for the first time near the coast once I got married to an American who had dollars and could afford what we South Africans often can't. This is a portmanteau poem as well. It's the title poem of the collection, and it consists of 6 parts, many of which represent a story of, or one could say, a biography of apartheid for me as somebody who lived both through it and after it. The history of intimacy. 1. You remember it because it's a wound, a cut, 20 cuts, the name for canings on the palm, on the knuckles, on the buttocks, a finely graded order of pain that we, who should not exist, were assigned for our failures. 2. You keep you white now? Mike shouts in 1987 across the heads of students sitting on Jamison steps, and the sudden pale silence shows we are no longer in uniform in the quad at Livingston High, teasing, hey, why did you look through me as though I don't exist? And this slipping from being we called keeping you white. But saying it out loud reveals how we have learned to measure our existence. 3. In the video store, after I've ordered a film, my cousin elbows me. Why are you putting on? Putting on. Transitive verb. Putting on what? Putting on skin. Putting on not nothingness. 4. When the Group Areas Act is abolished, my mother aches to go back to the street she was removed from. And it is we, grown attached to the scar we call home, who say, no, we don't want to live in a white area. This time, ceding it ourselves. 5. Mother, how do I write about you? As a medical student on night duty, you learned to sleep so lightly, you could wake in an instant in an emergency. And for the rest of your life, your body became a body that never again could sleep through the night. You told of one evening when, for some reason a little irked with my father, you left the table early, returning to the bedroom by yourself, and found my sister blue for lack of breath. To this day, you recall what anger gave you, how it saved my sister's life. Anger, breath. Since the beginning, you have been breath and poetry. You told me how Black students were asked to leave the room during the autopsy of white bodies. And of my writing about this, you said, that is my story. That is not your story. And now, with the illness you could not speak of for years, Mother, am I once again turning your words and your silence into a poem? 6. In 1988 at Crawford train station, my brother and I find a blue plank hand-painted in yellow letters. Non-whites only on one side, whites only on the other, thrown away by the fence next to the tracks. Picking it up, we see the 2 sides of the sign lay back to back, each half resting against its opposite, intimate and in verse, but unknown to each other. We knew this was history someone had made by hand, then hidden and tried to forget. We bring it home and come across it sometimes in a corner when we're looking for something else. Thank you.
Thank you. Gosh. Peace. Everyone probably needs a moment just to absorb that. But whenever you're ready, please. I can see you're unmuted, but we can't hear you. And I know you've been struggling as well, please. Oh, maybe she's reconnecting. Peace, we still can't hear you, I'm afraid. Can you hear us? Okay, I will just send Peace a message to say, there you are. Yay.
I'm here. Sorry, I got kicked out for a moment there. Would you like me to respond now? Okay, so thank you for this invitation, Srila and Cal. And Habiba, as always, it's a pleasure to be in conversation with you and to listen to you. And Durba, I am very pleased to engage your work as well. So I'm going to jump straight to it by saying that my discipline is psychology. And there are certain kinds of questions that tend to characterize my discipline. And for lack of a better descriptor, I would say these are questions about private life and interiority. Now, while I think these are important questions and are sometimes useful questions, I think they can also become limiting in the way that they tend to restrict questions about social and political arrangements to questions of interiority. And so in my engagement and response to both of you, and once again, thank you for your very brilliant contributions, I want to try and think outside of interiority for a moment, but I will come back to interiority. And what I want to do is to think about questions of public life. Because I think in some ways, this is what both of your work touches on. So there are certain things that I want you to kind of summarize in relation to what you've talked about. And I will talk specifically to each one of your works and then to think about a kind of concluding question. So firstly, I think it's not what you both do is not only something about archival work and the way that archival work interacts with the public. But I think in some ways, it's also an invitation for us to reimagine public life differently. And I think this is one of the functions of the kind of archival work that you do. So to reimagine public life differently in all of its temporalities, our relationships to the past, to the present, and to the future. But more than that, you both engage with the operations of power in and around the archive. So you talk through different moments and practices of surveillance, disciplinary and affective regimes, and how these become effective in the management of intimate lives. And in relation to this operation of power, I think part of what you also do is linking or engaging with the kind of intertwining, this management of intimate lives and the ways that it intertwines not only with gendered lives, but with racialized and classed lives as well. And I think what you both do, what you both offer to us is a kind of, you refuse the easy interiorization when we think about intimacy. So you refuse that and you engage with intimacies and public lives in very interesting ways that allow us to think about political and social arrangements. But at the same time, you do not run away from the interiority. And so I want to come back to that, to engage this public life, but to also engage our interior, intimate lives as well. And it is this very complex consideration that you both do of intimacy and the archive and what it tells us about public life that I think is very evident in the ways that you both differently engage intimacy. So more specifically, Durba's work, I think it's not only an interrogation of historical and continued gendered social arrangements. I think what you also do is a kind of exploration of women's intimate lives and sexuality. So once again, marrying this public and private. In your introduction, Derba, the introduction to your book specifically, you consider the omnipresence of a particular word, and it's a word that you talk about when you talked to us just now, the word prostitute, right? You consider the omnipresence of this word, but it's not just a word. You think about the way that this word never seems to stay in one place. And how you embarked on your research, and realizing that this word seems to traverse multiple archives. And so you talk about abortion, you talk about reproductive health and rights, you talk about all of this language, this word, in relation to all of these different archives as well. And I think maybe it's also a kind of a reflection of not just what the archive does, the function of the archive, but for us to also think about what it is that we seek to excavate in our archival work. And so part of what I want to think about, and maybe it's not so much a comment, but it's a question to you, is for you to say something about this excavation. I think at some point you say you'd gone into the research thinking about women's sexuality in a particular way, and finally confronting that you had to think about it across different terrains and archives. So to tell us something about this excavation, and more particularly, the kind of political possibilities that are made possible relative to the material conditions of this possibility. So what is it that makes it possible for the emergence of a particular subject, for this subject to, and for us to understand this subject and the ways that this intersects to construct women's sexuality and sexual and intimate lives. So something about this excavation and the possibilities of possibility. But I also want to flag something here, which you flag in your book. And that is that as much as you surfaced all of these archives that have to do with the domination and control of women's intimate lives and sexual lives, you also excavate other kinds of archives. You surface knowledge that is not recorded in the books, in the historical books, in the government books. And these are archives and narratives that you draw from the women themselves. So to say something also about that kind of archival work, this kind of surfacing of knowledge that is not recorded. Habiba, once you also talk about a kind of excavation of political and social arrangements. And there's also the kind of engagement with this public life and interior lives as well. But you offer us something else. You offer us roots to intimacy. You offer us a leaning into intimacy. You offer us ways to think about the erasure of intimacy. But you also offer us the way to think about the possibilities of intimacy. And always, always in relation to political economies. Always in relation to the ways that we can think about intimacies of horror, but also other kinds of intimacies that are a lot more desirable. And so part of what I want to reflect with you is to think about this political economy within which intimacies unfold. Because I think it is simultaneously a violent, intimate, but also not intimate political economy, and thinking about the context of South Africa in particular. Because I think in order to be able to oppress people, in order to be able to dehumanize and to marginalize people, there is a kind of close proximity that is required. And yet this close proximity is intimate, but it is not intimacy. And so this kind of dance of intimacies that you invite us to engage with. In the history of intimacy, you talk about a young woman who wants to know something about how to write to her incarcerated boyfriend. And this conveys another kind of intimacy, an intimacy of loss and longing. But there's also the erasure of intimacy that is found in the laughter to her request, that silences her search for intimacy. So I would want you to also reflect something a little about particularly in terms of, I want to say method, but I also don't want to say method because it sounds crass. So instead I will say art, the art of poetry, and the way that you use this art to almost explore embodied life in all of its myriad forms. The themes that you explore, the worlds that you explore, it's not just this embodied lives, but it's themes around desire, around aloneness, around grief, around loss, around hope. And somehow in engaging all of this interiority, you return the body to a public life and invite us to think about intimacy as always, always connected to these political and cultural economies. So to kind of tie all of these together, I think both of what you do is you flag to us the interest of disciplinary regimes in intimacy. And so that intimacy, it's not just about what people do to each other, with each other in their private moments, but also to think about intimacy as a systematic, calculated consideration of state intervention in people's lives, a consideration of racialized and gendered lives as part of domination and control. And so in some ways, what you both do is you also take the body as a site of affect operation in culture. And I really like the way that you both differently engage with this body and affect in culture. And you think about it in terms of an overspill. Derba, I think you used the word excess. But I'm very interested in this overspill of the body in public life, in terms of its intensity. And to kind of round this up, Habiba, you do flag this as you spoke to us, but I notice in your book, Intimacy, the History of Intimacy, and also in your book, Derba, that your dedications are both to your mothers. And so I would ask you to humor me, and with a last question to both of you, to think about another kind of excavation and the way that you both excavate your mothers in your dedication. And maybe if you want to say something to us about that and how that was fundamental to the way that you then think about your journeys into feminist archival work. And thank you to both of you.
Thank you. Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you.
That was just so lovely. Srila, should we respond and then take questions? Okay. Would you like to go first?
All right. Thank you for that. Intensely rich, and again, scribbling frantically. I'll start with your question about the dedication to my mother. And as I mentioned, my family configuration was a founding one for me to imagine the world. You know, my mother was a medical doctor, as I mentioned, and so I really thought that that was the prescribed path for girls. All girls had to become doctors. And my father, being a house husband and a tailor, thought, oh, I suppose boys can choose where to work, in the house or outside the house. So it was a very interesting normality for me, which was countered, of course, by the other normalities I learned about through friends, through the media. And my mother is there at the beginning, at all beginnings. She's certainly there at the foundation of my life and my imagination. But she is also there where I distanced myself and where I abandoned and rejected. And she's the route I found back into those spaces that I had distanced myself from. So to my mother, I offer many forms of gratitude, and some of them unspoken because they are painful as well. You are right that intimacies are ways to mark those spaces of tenderness, but also the space of extreme constriction, because intimacy is closeness, and where the closeness meets the skin, meets the imagination, is intimate, but also painful. To use Keguro Macharia's phrase, the frottage, the rubbing against the skin, that moment indeed of painful closeness. So I find it a route and a method, and the art of poetry is really mysterious to me. It took me 20 years to write the poem that you were quoting about, the young woman who had sought in poetry a way of arriving at an intimacy that was forbidden to her, and instead found in it one of the most painful exclusions. So poetry, like intimacy, is not the route to a happy ending. It's not the simple route. It's a much more mysterious route beyond my capacity to control, but perhaps within my capacity to approach delicately, with honor, and with a knowledge that the painful closeness is a risk there as well. So I think that's what I can say until I look through my notes some more. And now over to Durba.
This is just such a beautiful comment. And I'm just I feel very lucky to be in conversation, in part because I was thinking about the very different ways in which we gave our presentations, and the move from a very distant sensibility in what, a question of the history of epistemology, to the poetic, and to thinking about the way we view someone in an archive or in an ocean or in front of us. And your question about my dedication, I think that the best writing in my book is the one paragraph where I talk about my mom. And it was the hardest thing to write for me, because I tend to write at a distance. And I tend to write at a distance because I'm uncomfortable, even though my whole sense of self, every question that I ask is based around this relationship with my mother, and also bearing witness to the kind of social violence that she experienced as a woman. That's the story that I'm telling, but I decided to tell it in a kind of distant way in the first book. And I'm realizing that more and more that I'm trying to answer the same question over and over again in the work that I'm doing, and trying to get closer and closer to the feeling or the way that my body in the world produced a question. Whereas I tried to make it not about my body at all in my book. And that has to do with, my mother came to the United States when she was pregnant with me, and she was the victim of an extraordinarily violent relationship, as is extremely common in a lot of settings of domestic violence. And her escape to the United States is what saved her life and mine and my brother's. And that escape, and then of the social condemnation that happened after, as she encountered the diasporic communities, the kind of social violence that was part of her everyday life, and the perception of her being in excess of her own sexuality, has really shaped my intellectual questions. But I didn't know how to tell that story. And when, Habiba, you said, that is my story in the way that your mother describes herself, I often think about that with my mother. She feels a deep sense that that's her story, and then, that I shouldn't be writing it, until very recently when she asked me to write about her. And I think about those ethics a lot, about what it means to write. And I think in that sense, Peace, you have an expertise that I don't have. Your expertise, as you said, is the question of interiority. And I think I've spent my life running away from the painful closeness that interiority makes us ask, and trying to go to the epistemological, the question of knowledge. And more I'm realizing that I'm trying to bring the epistemological and the question of intimacy together. And so one thing I've learned is you can write more than one book, hopefully. And so the idea is that, you know, in the future, I dream of the possibilities of writing and the experiments of writing that would allow. And that kind of, you know, gets at, I just want to say, I loved how you described, what does it mean to seek to excavate an archive? And what do we seek when we excavate an archive? And what are the, as you said, piece in beautiful phrasing, political possibilities made possible through the emergence of looking at a particular political subject in the language of Habiba, the way that language is imprinted upon a land or bodies. That's very much what my project is about. I often think about where are we going to find our politics? And I think about that a lot now, because that question of what we seek in the archives, what kind of political imaginary we seek, I've come to realize more and more that I don't know if I look for my freedom or for freedom for women that I write on or people that I write on in the kind of cruel, violent archives of social science that I study. I don't seek only, you know, the glimpses of agency and form in that archive, because that archive was never meant to tell me about freedom. For me, the question is, what language did that art, what is the language or vocabulary that I've inherited from that tradition, from those modes of writing on land and people and bodies? And what are other ways and vocabularies, other lexicons of writing, other possibilities of writing that help us reimagine how we write ourselves? And I feel like that has really made me think that we have to return again to those art lexicons, because so often we use that terminology. For example, I think a good example is kinship, of to try to imagine otherwise. Kinship is definitely about intimacy, and we think about that all of the time, but also what are the roots, the etymological roots of this category, and what are the kind of violent complications that are folded into the very origins of that idea, that gets at, in some ways, what Habiba was saying, that there is no poetry that tells us an answer for just, there's no simple kind of sense of liberation that comes from it. It's often very painful. And that painfulness is kind of folded into the categories that we use. That's, I think, the first way that I can respond.
Thank you, brilliant. Can I also take up, you know, the question of etymology has been for me one of the richest forms of knowledge making. It's present, of course, in all forms of uses of language, in poetry and the social sciences. And it was actually in the over-familiarity of words that had become so familiar they were invisible. So an intimacy that makes things too close to see or too easy to see, and therefore to see through. And this is the reason that my book on Muslims, on images of Islam in South Africa, starts by looking through that lens of etymology to see if that method allows us to look closer and with new attention. So it is certainly, I think, not the case for me that I moved from the social sciences to poetry as a kind of evolution, but they actually existed side by side and did different things with language. And sometimes the poetry informed my critical work, and certainly the critical work was flowing constantly into the poetry, because poetry allowed me to ask questions or to linger in irresolution the way that the critical work didn't. And one other example of this overfamiliarity, to the extent of being kitsch, is the way in which certain images of Muslims who were enslaved at the time of the image's production, and later were liberated, emancipated, enslaved people, they nonetheless were portrayed not through scenes of violence and brutality, which accurately describe the experience of slavery at the Cape, but through kitsch images of compliant, colorful, skilled, and complacent slaves. So these images were so familiar, so reassuring, so powerful in their casualness, in their, they were represented on recipe book covers, they were represented in postcards, in calendars, they represented the past for a certain vision of the colonial period, but a past that was utterly emptied of its violence. And the very way to portray a benign version of slavery was to show enslaved people portrayed in this marginal and exoticized and cute way. And so these images were abundant, including in an academic conference that marked the 100th anniversary of The Heart of Darkness, the publication of Conrad's novel. Multiple ironies abound in that, but the image that opened the program for that conference, which was held in 1998, was an image of an enslaved person, unnotated, not acknowledged as such, but that signaled the 19th century sufficiently in a generic way. So to look again at archives that are not inaccessible, but are unthinkable, that too is one of the great gifts of the critical vocabulary. And for me, that they have definitely lived simultaneously together, and they have called to my imagination at different times. And in some ways it is the technical infrastructure of the university that now recognizes my poetry as intellectual work that has allowed me to spend more time in this realm. The other realm is still with me if I'm able to configure my mind back into that space. I suffered a concussion 3 years ago, so it's actually quite hard for me to re-enter the critical space and the poetic space. I haven't written anything new since that time, but I definitely find both of those spaces to be utterly necessary for me to produce at least for me, the forms of knowledge that emerge from my experience.
I feel like, as you described, of your concussion, there are these pivotal events in the body that transform how we can see the world. And I think we don't talk enough about those things, so I think about that. I've been writing prolifically about my mother since the beginning of the pandemic because I fear for her life constantly. I feared for her life before, but it for some reason became a kind of preoccupation for me. And then, so I wrote a particular way, but none of it is writing that one would, as in I was writing something, but it went towards nothing. And so there are these pivotal events in the body. And I think my body has changed since then. I can't imagine a writing otherwise now. And, there are these things that happen to our bodies that we don't always acknowledge so I really appreciate you thinking with that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think what you've just kind of you've in a sense answered a question that I'd put to you about what is it that we want from the archive or when we do archival work, and what you've just described there. I know you say cuteness, but I would also say the everydayness of violence. So you almost it's this banality of violence that this historical archive takes for granted. So yeah, the images that we see on recipe books, that almost normalizes and makes banal these different forms of violence and historical violences as well. So in some sense, I think that is part of well, it's the political work, but I think it's also the moral work of the kind of archival excavation that we do as well, to expose that banality.
I agree completely. Yeah. And to render the presence of the intellectual work that is there, for instance, in the cooking, which is portrayed in a certain way in those recipe books, but actually that cooking is intellectual work. It is also cultural work and political work, which has shaped a certain version of, what counts as South African, for instance. It is
Yes.
It is also the space in which certain the makings of the language, for instance, that was a slave Creole that later becomes appropriated for white nationalism. It is the space in which that language is made, that extremely violent space of uneasy intimacy of the kitchen. So the excavation is actually for us as well to recognize where the intellect lives. And it certainly does not live only in the critical vocabulary, which is in fact what I had been inducted into, that is where the really powerful brains operate. Well, they were also operating in places that were not recognized. And it took me so long to be able to unhinge my mind from that particular set of expectations of where I would find the forms and the practices of a liberated mind, a liberated imagination. To quote Desiree Lewis, what are the true forms of liberation? And they cannot be as limited as the archive that we have inherited.
And I just want to follow, I'll just say the last thing, which is that when you said that poetry allowed you to linger in irresolution, I love that phrase. And I would just say that I think a lot of what you're describing is that there's two sides, right? Which is that there's the intellectual work of the body, of the other forms of speaking, of being that happens in cooking and everyday practices. But there's also the irresolution that actually exists in the social sciences or in critical theory that we refuse to recognize. And I think on both sides, right, that so much of what I was trying to say in the first book is that there's more critical fabulation in the social sciences, or not critical fabulation, sorry, there's more fabulation in the social sciences than there is, facticity, that the claim of fact is a practice of fabulation. So all of a sudden our orientation towards what counts as good critical theory might change when we see that irresolution exists in multiple spaces, including those that claim to be resolved in the first place.
Thank you.
Durba, if I can just grab your attention, there is a direct question to you. Have you had a chance to see the question?
I did. And
yes, I didn't want to, not give you the opportunity to respond to the question. And we do have a little bit of time.
So thank you so much, Kiguro, for this amazing question. So the question, I'll just read it out. Shall I read it out? I don't know if everyone can see it.
Oh, yes, please. Actually, sorry, I should have done that because it's on the Q&A and not on the chat. So if you could just...
So I'm wondering if you could you'd speculate a little on what makes the prostitute such a mobile and sticky category. Mobile, moving across fields and political strategies and aesthetic modes and geohistories. Sticky, latching onto and marking a range of figures. In part, I'm thinking about this because so much legislation from colonial India is then mapped onto colonial Anglophone Africa, including many of these understandings of the prostitute. Thanks. This is a great question. It's one that I have contemplated a lot in terms of the writing of the book. My answer in the context of the book was to say that the prostitute is sticky and mobile because the prostitute is in some ways the very making of the modern study of society as we understand it. And in the context of India, the study or the legal structures that are created in the Contagious Diseases Acts, but also questions of forensic medicine, in ethnology, those circulate very widely. So India is a critical exemplar in the making of a universalist knowledge that travels. One of the things I found since writing the book is, that the deepest resonances I've found are between myself and scholars working on the Caribbean or scholars working in Rhodesia. I'm thinking here of Ruda Madiwa's work, which is phenomenal on Zimbabwe, that we are seeing a phenomenon across geographies that resonates so deeply. It has an intimacy itself. That is, I think, because there is, I mean, this is just a partial answer. I don't think I have a great answer for it. In some ways, my book is descriptive of a phenomenon that's happening rather than explanatory of why the phenomenon happens. But I do think, you know, if you look at any urban study, and this includes, and I'm thinking here of Saidiya Hartman's extraordinary Wayward Lives, here also of any kind of study of modern European urban spaces in the 18th and 19th centuries, the great majority of early sociology starts with the study of trying to understand, you know, the problem of prostitution or prostitutes. And so the early categories that we use to describe social life actually come through that study. And that's one of the things that I find really, you know, essential. And I think, Kigoro, you have said this in so many spaces, and certainly in several threads, which is that there has to be more ways to think across. That's not the comparative project of the colonial world. That is to say, it's not about analogizing that the colonial prostitute in India functioned like the colonial prostitute in the context of colonial Kenya, or colonial South Africa. It is to say that there is an epistemological resonance that requires a project of thinking together. And I think that that's different than the colonial project of comparison. So, and I think, Srila, you started this, you know, that the Governing Intimacies project as a project is about bringing together two spaces, and that some of that project has been about juxtaposing to find similarity, but also to think about radical difference and allow that radical difference to help both spaces to imagine differently. That it's in the encounter of difference that you find the possibility of thinking otherwise, whether thinking otherwise for imagining a social movement against authoritarianism, of thinking otherwise. I find this in the material I'm looking at now from the 70s and 80s, the way a certain set of African feminists writing even in contexts like the UN really center questions of sexuality, whereas in the context of South Asia, the question of sexuality, queer sexualities, but also any kind of conception of feminized sexuality is disappeared largely. And you can see those differences when they're put next to one another. And so again, this is a kind of intimacy. I think I was thinking about the etymology of intimacy, and it is to impress upon also, right? It is something in closeness, but it is also something that impresses upon. And I think we can think of these epistemologies in a category like prostitute in the way that Habeba described, as that language that writes itself onto lands and bodies. That particular language of the prostitute as this kind of flexible idea could impress itself upon so many things.
Brilliant. Wow, what an honor to realize who's in the audience as well.
Habeba, please, we just have a few more minutes, so any final thoughts? I'm also going to invite Kyle to,
Well, I also was thinking about another example of similar to the K word, which I write about in Regarding Muslims, and that is about the familiarity of the P word. I'm quoting here a play called Reclaiming the P word for Puss, which is the vulgar Afrikaans word for vagina, which is a word that the play Reclaiming the P word says you encounter as a child, written on desks, on toilet doors, on bus stops, and it's a public word for an unsayable thing, but which is broadly publicly heard. And so this word actually is another legacy of the colonial period and its institution of South Africa to come on the basis of sexual violence. So the word is also used in Yvette Christiance's mesmerizing book about the enslaved woman Silla. The book is Unconfessed, which was published in 2006 for the first time. And that word is constantly invoked in that book, which is a book entirely spoken by a woman who never speaks in public to defend herself from the charge of murder of her child, an enslaved child, for which she is convicted. And this book comes from the archives, in that after 2 decades of research in the archives, Christianse finds an account of a woman in a court record who refuses to speak except for one word, hartseer, heart sore. And this book, is built on that silence, that refusal, that rejection, as well as on this one word that is spun into 300 pages of an interior monologue, in which this woman recounts the reality of what it is to be an enslaved woman at that time in the Cape, at that time in the book, the early 19th century. But that word speaks then of an unspeakable reality, not only of slavery, which, as I mentioned, is portrayed in this twisted, contorted way, which makes it both visible and completely invisible in the reality of South Africa today. But it lives forth in the legacy of a pandemic of sexual violence, which we speak of here in South Africa, and perhaps the word epidemic is similarly used in India. So I think that invites me and us to think further, about this idea that it's a natural phenomenon, an extreme phenomenon, but it's a natural phenomenon, this sexual violence. And why was it made natural? It is because it was not possible to rape an enslaved woman, and enslaved people constituted the majority of the population of the Cape Colony at periods in the history. And there was no such category as the rape of an enslaved woman. And it happened that the slave lodge was also the main brothel of the Cape. So, this building in of the invisibility and normality and the naturalness of sexual slavery, or prostitution as it was called then, is so foundational to our understanding of what our contemporary world looks like and our contemporary subjectivities look like. So I really find the resonances between our work incredibly productive and yes, inspiring of more thinking. And so again, Srila and Peace, thank you for the conversation that you've enabled. Thank you for this opportunity to be near each other, to be adjacent to each other.
I'm so grateful. And I just want to say really quickly, first of all, thinking about the question of pandemic or epidemic language for sexual violence, it reminds me of the opening of Sarah Deer's work on sexual violence in Indigenous Native American communities here in the United States. And she says, why do we use this naturalized word to try to think about a politics, right? So that so much of the work of imagining a politics against sexual violence is to denaturalize the language of public health that has come to dominate how we think about this. It just kind of strikes me how much resonance there is in what you describe as that the word prostitution is linked, we know is so deeply, intimately tied to the question of sexual violence. And that may go back to what Kigoro is asking as well, which is that to call someone a prostitute means that they have agency in whatever they're supposedly doing, according to the way the state perceives it. And that then, redeems the state. And as you said, it makes it cute, the complacency, right, of the people who are being called a certain name. And I just wanted to say lastly, so thank you so much, Srila, and thank you for this amazing seminar series. The image behind me is by a Nigerian Bangladeshi American poet, writer, Abir Hook, who also takes photos of, and it kind of gives me an imaginary for how I think about Habebo's work and otherwise, of trying to dream otherwise.
Thank you. How gorgeous.
Peace, and maybe just to wrap up.
Well, I guess my concluding thoughts is about imagination. I mean, when we engage the archive, we're not only trying to excavate, we're trying to imagine freeing futures. But I also want to just come back to something that my friend and colleague Grace Musila always talks about, which is this idea of a wicked imagination, and so always that kind of balancing act that we do to imagine futures that could be freeing, but to also never run away from the wicked imaginations that have made these intimacies of horror possible.
Thank you.
Kyle, would you like to say some final thoughts?
I mean, really, this has been such a rich and fascinating webinar. I mean, the only thing I can say is that we couldn't have hoped for a richer panel. So compelling. And I'm really glad that you have left us with so much to think about for the future. So again, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, there is actually one question, but we're going to have to wrap up. Though, as a way of doing a further shout out to the project, we did host quite an important conversation yesterday on the law in relation to a recent and ongoing legal case. So is it Gaito and everyone else? I'm very happy to direct your attention to that recording when it's available. So that just leaves me to say final thank yous. I mean, I think it's something, Kyle, we're going to take full credit for this, something about smart curation, because I have heard Durba since last year talking about her book, and I'm always blown away. But this one, I have to say, this is where it's who you put people in conversation with, right? That it's yeah, it was just so moving and poignant and on so many different levels. So thank you. It felt like quite a feast. And Habiba, at the start, we were all moaning about the load shedding. I'm sure Peace would also agree that, you know, all of this really helps to make our days feel like there's more to this, right? than our collective complaining about the present conditions. Just to say to everyone who's here still with us now, but who's been following, I mean, obviously, you know, Kaio and I are for journal special issue, but some are slightly different. You know, we're hoping to do quite a different way. You know, hopefully this is the beginning. I mean, both the webinar series this year and the one last year is, and indeed the project is the beginning of our collective thinking and feeling through these issues. And yeah, please keep an eye out on what's to come and keep in touch. So thank you so much, Habiba, Durba, and Peace, for joining. And yeah, I'm so grateful. All right, bye everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Srila.